Hello and welcome to the Cole.notcole podcast. I am so excited for you guys to be here today. We are going to be talking about hate in this country today because I think this is a subject that needs to be talked about. You guys know that I post on social media a lot. I post on TikTok, on Instagram, and I write my articles on Substack. And one of the things I've been covering a lot lately is immigration, whether that's to do with the temporary foreign worker program here in Canada, or whether it's just about immigration in general. I've also been talking about what's been going on in the Middle East between Gaza and Israel. And I've also been covering a little bit about what's going on in Quebec, specifically with their ban on public prayer. And one of the things that I've noticed that is most striking to me is that out of all my content, this is the thing that most people are divided on, or that they have very strong opinions about. And so I want to talk a little bit about that today and why people feel that way, whether those feelings are justified or not. I want to start out by prefacing this by saying that I think it is okay for us to have, or I know that it's okay for us to have conversations about immigration, and you are not a racist person for having conversations about immigration. However, how you frame those conversations, how you frame your talking points is really important. And I bring this up because a lot of times in my comments, I will see people saying things like, well, I know immigration is out of control. I've been to my local Tim Hortons and everybody working there is brown. Reality check for some people here in Canada. You don't need to be white to be a Canadian citizen. You don't need to be white in order to be born in Canada. I think that is a disgusting talking point to use, to say that because somebody is a different color or because they have a bit of an accent, that suddenly they are an immigrant on a different level than you. Ultimately, we are all immigrants, unless you are a First Nations person. And I am going to talk a little bit later on, perhaps, about First Nations and Indigenous peoples, because they have underwent systemic racism for decades in this country, and it continues to this day. And so one of the things that I talked about on a TikTok this week was the temporary foreign worker program. And one thing that I think people are not understanding is that the temporary foreign worker program is one very small program within our larger immigration system. Temporary foreign workers does not include international students. It doesn't include spouses that are sponsored to come to Canada. It doesn't include a variety of specialized programs that ultimately involve immigrants to coming to work in Canada. The temporary foreign worker program is meant to be not long-term, and it's mostly historically meant to be for seasonal workers on farms, specifically around agriculture. I think one thing that people are missing is that the temporary foreign worker program in and of itself is quite small, but also that when we talk about the program, we're also talking about people's livelihoods, not just of the workers, but of the businesses that rely on temporary foreign workers. And it is very disingenuous to say that all companies are exploiting the temporary foreign worker program or that there is no need for the temporary foreign worker program. Pierre Poilievre has pitched this idea of getting rid of the temporary foreign worker program. That is one of the stupidest arguments that he could make. It does not take into account that there are hundreds and thousands of businesses that rely on temporary foreign workers, whether it's one worker or 10 workers. They rely on those workers because there is no quote unquote Canadians to fill those positions or that want to do those jobs. I'll give you the perfect example. I grew up in the horse racing industry. It relies on temporary foreign workers. There is not a situation where that industry survives without temporary foreign workers. And so to say, well, we're going to end the entire program, you are essentially saying, well, we are going to end the livelihoods of thousands of small businesses that rely on one or two foreign workers every single year to make their business work, to make it happen. And you need to take those things into account when you are talking about these programs. Does that mean that there are not businesses exploiting it? 100% there are businesses that are exploiting the temporary foreign worker program. 100% there are loopholes in the program. 100% there are people who are outright lying to the government when it comes to the temporary foreign worker program about the wages that they're paying their workers. There has been many documented instances where people will advertise a job at, say, $35 an hour for a temporary foreign worker to meet that threshold of wages in order to get a temporary foreign worker, and basically they will make an agreement with that worker who they've pre-selected already. And people have to understand that when they are getting temporary foreign workers, it's not like they're just getting some random person from another country that is like on a lottery system. They know who they are getting. They've already usually picked out who they want to come and work for them, or it's referred by somebody who's already in Canada, and they have taken steps to essentially get a permit to have a temporary foreign worker, and they are just letting that process play out. And what they do is they make an agreement with that worker that they've already selected in another country. I'm going to advertise this job at $35 an hour, but when you get here, I'm actually not going to pay you that. I'm going to pay you $35 an hour, but then you're going to reimburse me $15 an hour out of your check, which is one of the ways that people scam the system. This happens all the time. They also have situations where they will force all of their foreign workers to live in one house and pay a certain amount of rent. In this instance, these employers are actually making money off the rent. It is ridiculous. So is there gaps in the temporary foreign worker program that we need to look into, and we need to make sure that people aren't exploiting the program? 100%. But to say that we're going to end the entire program, just get rid of it, is so disingenuous, is so unlikely. Pierre Poilievre knows himself that this cannot happen. So let's talk about reasonable steps that we can take to make sure that there are proper safeguards in place to protect the temporary foreign workers that are being exploited. That's what this conversation should be about. Is there temporary foreign workers that are quote unquote stealing jobs from Canadians? Maybe in some situations, maybe if you want to classify it that way. But ultimately, protecting temporary foreign workers will mean that they're not being exploited, which will mean that it is less likely that businesses will use these programs and will just hire local people instead if they are not able to find ways to, essentially scam the system. Saying that, scammers will always be scammers. So people that are scamming the temporary foreign worker program or are doing things that are illegal are likely going to continue to do things that are illegal in their business. So there is that aspect of it too. The other interesting thing that Pierre Poilievre brought up this week was during a speech, when he was calling for the end of the temporary foreign worker program, he was asked a question by a reporter about the Liberal government's intention to recognize a Palestinian state in September, in the month we're in. This will happen specifically on September 22nd. His response to that, well, I'm going to play it for you, but essentially he calls the state of Palestine a Hamas state.
From Omni News, Liberal government is intent to recognize Palestine as a state in this fall session. What's your take on it? Are you in favor or do you oppose this?
Mark Carney doesn't know where he stands. He first said he was going to recognize the Hamas state, and then the other day he said that he wasn't recognizing the Hamas state. So he seems very confused.
When I heard that clip, I posted on TikTok about it, about how disgusted I was with him, but I want to add some more context to that. Pierre Poilievre has been framing this like this for quite some time, and it is deliberate. It is in order to paint Palestinians as a whole as terrorists, which is exactly what Israel has been doing. I watched a news documentary last night on YouTube where they were interviewing an Israeli woman who is living in one of the illegal settlements in the West Bank. And she said, I don't even know if I can say this online. I don't want my account to get taken away. But she essentially said, the good Arab is you know what I'm going to say. A good Arab is a dead Arab, which is just, that kind of gives you an idea of this narrative that they're spinning in Israel and the amount of racism that exists there towards Palestinian people. It is abhorrent. And the guy who is running for the highest seat in our country is perpetrating that sort of xenophobia, of racism, of hate. And it is completely unacceptable. It's hard to even put into words. It's hard to even talk about. We have an ongoing issue of Islamophobia in this country. I think that was, it is long rooted in our country. I think it got worse around 9/11, largely by the United States and the rhetoric that they painted about Muslims at that time. And this, I don't even like to call it the conflict between Israel and Palestine, or more so Israel slaughtering Palestinians, has even perpetrated more Islamophobia. It has also perpetrated a lot of anti-Semitism in our country, which is another massive issue that I'm not going to leave out of this conversation. Because on top of Pierre Poilievre and many people creating this fake narrative that Palestinians as a whole represent Hamas, which is completely false, there is also this disgusting sort of speech that I see a lot in comment sections on videos, which says that, Hitler was right about the Jews. That is so unacceptable to say things like that. And it is also not helpful. This does not help the case of Palestinians in Gaza who are facing just one of the most horrific situations that anybody can even imagine. You are doing nothing to help Palestinians in Gaza by saying things like that. In fact, you are making it worse. And there is also no place for anti-Semitism in our country. People need to separate, first of all, Jewish people from the Israeli government. Although the people in the Israeli government may be Jewish, they do not represent all Jewish people. I think that is extremely important to remember. It is also important to remember that people living in Canada who happen to be Jewish are not over there perpetrating war crimes in Israel. Okay? They are not the ones that are committing war crimes. That is their faith, being Jewish, and trying to conflate being Jewish with the Israeli government is not something that is helping the case of Palestinians in Gaza, who are facing, like I said, one of the most unthinkable situations that you can even imagine. The other thing that we can talk about is the ban on public prayer in Quebec. I posted a video about this last week, and a lot of people had a lot of opinions. The first one that I thought was interesting is that there's a lot of people who don't believe that religion sort of has any place in society, so to speak. And they say, well, we want people to keep their religion private. And so, a ban on public prayer is reasonable, has nothing to do with targeting a certain race. We just shouldn't have any public prayer, whether it's Christians or Catholics or Muslims or Jews. There should just be no public prayer. And I can understand that sentiment, but I think you have to first realize that we have freedom of expression in this country. And part of that is being able to express your faith. For some people, that's wearing a cross on your neck. It's wearing a religious symbol. For some people, that may be wearing certain pieces of clothing. And banning a public prayer, first of all, it is, taking away the rights and freedoms of Canadians, because there are a lot of Canadians who pray in public spaces and they have a right to do that. We even see street preachers often. And although I may not agree with them, and I may not, I'll make it clear to all of you, I don't really consider myself to be a religious person in any sense. I'm not sure whether God exists or not. That's just my own personal belief. I'll find out when I die. But I also believe that people have a right to express their faith if they want to do that, as long as the expression of their faith doesn't turn into hate speech. I think that's where the line is drawn. I think if people are going around and chanting death to a certain group and then saying, well, that's just my religion, I think that is unacceptable. I do think it's acceptable for people to talk about their faith in different ways or to express their faith in different ways that aren't targeting certain groups of people. And I think we need to protect those rights of people. That is my personal opinion. And I understand some people disagree with that. But you do have to recognize that Quebec banning public prayer came from protests that involved prayer as it relates to what is going on in Gaza right now. And instead of the government addressing a certain group of the population who are obviously feeling hurt and feeling targeted and are concerned about what is going on in the Middle East, instead they're saying, you can't pray in public. This is unacceptable. Protests happen and block roads often. I'm not saying it's legal, but protests happen. And if they just so happen to be praying at that time, I don't think that's a reason to ban public prayer. That would be like somebody protesting, gay rights or trans rights, and then them saying, well, we can't have pride parades anymore. We can't do that. We can't have public displays of sexuality. It just doesn't make sense to me. And so while it may be inconvenient to people and it may make you feel uncomfortable to see somebody praying, I don't think that's a reason to ban public prayer. It's also important to point out that this is not happening every day. This has happened a handful of times over the last 2 years. It's not happening every day. This is not causing massive unrest in Quebec. And it's also important to recognize that, yes, there is a separation of church and state. Public prayer is not part of government. So people partaking in public prayer is a lot different than the government creating laws based on religion. That is not what they are banning here. They are banning people's individual rights that we have under our charter rights in Canada. The other thing I wanted to touch on before I kind of wrap this all up into one is that we have systemic racism here towards First Nations and Indigenous people in this country. And I've been talking a bit about, residential schools as well as the 60s scoop here in Canada over the past week. There was a story about a man who ended up growing up in New Zealand who was actually taken away from his mother here in the 60s scoop. He was taken away from his mother. We don't know the exact circumstances around that time, but children were taken away from Indigenous and First Nations family based off of racism, basically. They would look at situations and say, well, there's too many people living in one house and that's not good for a child, so we'll take them away. They would basically look for any reason they could take a child away because it was part of the government's program to assimilate Indigenous and First Nations, and it really stripped them of their culture. That's what it was. And when the residential schools were not working anymore because people started to realize around the 50s that these schools were committing atrocities to children, that children were dying in these schools. They were starving to death. They were getting lots of diseases in these schools. There was a bit of public outrage, and the government saw that these schools were not popular anymore. And so their new idea was that, well, we will just go take children away from First Nations families and adopt them out, not only in Canada, but around the world. And they advertised around the world that you could get a child from Canada quickly. No red tape. You could just adopt a child. And even in Canada, you were actually seen as progressive if you adopted a Indigenous child, because essentially you were saving them from residential school. And so the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, when this was happening, was not that long ago. And there is still this systemic racism that exists in our country that believes that First Nations and Indigenous people are less than everybody else, or that they are incapable or less capable than everyone else. That is not true. They face barriers that nobody else faces. They have faced trauma and abuse that nobody else faces because of how our systems were set up and continue to be set up that greatly disadvantage them. Part of that is where we forced them to live when we took their land, and we forced them to go live on pieces of land that were in the bush, in the swamps, where you can't plow the land, you can't make a living off the land. And so they had no money. It's really hard to build communities and to provide services for your people if you have no money. And we did that. Now, am I trying to hamper down and say that we haven't taken steps when it comes to reconciliation? Sure, we have, but we have a lot of work to do. But the idea that we have given, there's this idea that I see from people, or hear from people often, we've given them enough. We don't need to do anything else. No, we put them in this situation. It is our job to help lift them out of poverty in many cases, to provide them with better opportunities and to turn our wrongs into rights. Not that we can ever properly do that, but there needs to be a better understanding that, this just didn't happen 100 years ago or 200 years ago or 300 years ago. People like to act like this is so far in the past, it doesn't matter anymore. No, there are still people around the world and in Canada who were greatly affected by the government and their policies towards Indigenous and First Nations people. And to wrap this all up, I guess what I want to say is that while we all have our own personal responsibility when it comes to, making sure that we are not being racist or xenophobic or Islamophobic or anti-Semitic, it also needs to start at the top with people like Pierre Poilievre, who are saying things that are extremely dangerous, who dog whistle to certain groups of people, who make it normal to call an entire group of people terrorists, which then normalizes behavior towards other groups of people. Similar how people try to normalize anti-Semitic behavior towards an entire group of Israelis or Jews because of what the Israeli government is doing. In the same way that people try to normalize or make it seem okay that because somebody who is Indigenous commits a crime that suddenly all of them are criminals. It does not work that way. It does not work that way. That is unacceptable behavior. That is an unacceptable way of thinking. In the same way that people try to group together immigrants and saying that if they see one immigrant commit a crime, that suddenly they're all committing crimes. Or that if one business is taking advantage or exploiting temporary foreign workers that suddenly every business is exploiting or taking advantage of temporary foreign workers. That is not the case. And it requires some people to take a look in the mirror, do some soul searching, and use facts, especially when it comes to immigration. I think numbers are really important, and your facts, your feelings are not facts. That is what I wanted to say. Thank you for listening to my podcast today. It was a bit of a rant. I'm planning to do more of these. If you enjoyed listening to me rant a little bit like this and get my opinion, let me know what you think in the comments, and we will see you guys again soon.